Dr. Margaret Thompson's bloodied hands trembled as she pressed against the lioness's swollen belly, her surgical gloves slick with amniotic fluid under the merciless African sun. The radio crackled with static. "Margaret, are you still alive out there?" This wasn't supposed to be a rescue mission. It was meant to be her final act. Samuel Mitchell dropped his rifle, his weathered face draining of color as he recognized the woman he'd spent 20 years hating. Chief Ranger Mbekki's voice echoed across the savannah. "Dear God, she's actually doing it." The metallic scent of blood mixed with acacia blossoms as hyenas circled in the distance, their calls piercing the stillness. Margaret's wedding ring caught the light as she worked. Robert would have understood why she'd come here to die, but not why she was now fighting so desperately to save a life that wasn't human. Her medical bag lay open beside her, morphine vials gleaming like deadly promises she might never need. "Radio for backup now!" Samuel barked, his voice cracking with disbelief. How had a suicide mission become a fight for 2 lives? And could either of them survive what was coming? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 24 hours earlier, Dr. Margaret Thompson had stepped off the dusty Land Cruiser at Serengeti Heritage Reserve with a secret that would have horrified her fellow passengers. Hidden beneath her medical supplies, wrapped in sterile gauze like a parting gift, lay enough morphine to end the pain that had consumed her since Robert's funeral 18 months ago. At 67, the renowned trauma surgeon from Minneapolis had saved thousands of lives, but she couldn't save the one that mattered most, her marriage to her daughter Sarah. "You kept him alive too long, Mom." Sarah's words still echoed in Margaret's mind from their last conversation. Watching him suffer like that was cruel. The accusation had shattered something irreparable between them. After Robert's funeral, Sarah had simply stopped calling, stopped visiting, stopped being her daughter. Margaret's house in Edina felt like a mausoleum, filled with medical journals no one would read and Christmas cards no one would send. The $50,000 she'd paid for this exclusive conservation medicine experience represented her entire retirement savings. Money that would have been Sarah's inheritance. Instead, Margaret had chosen Tanzania's remote wilderness as her final resting place, far from the disappointed faces of family who saw her as a woman who'd lost her purpose. "At least here," she'd whispered to Robert's photograph in her luggage, "no one will have to pretend they're surprised." Samuel Mitchell had been assigned as her guide with barely concealed resentment. The 34-year-old ranger carried himself with military precision, his mixed Tanzanian-American heritage evident in features that seemed familiar, though Margaret couldn't place why. His hostility puzzled her. Most locals were eager to please wealthy American tourists, but Samuel's dark eyes held something deeper than professional courtesy. When she'd introduced herself as a retired doctor volunteering her services, his jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly. "Another American here to save Africa," he'd muttered under his breath, words she'd pretended not to hear. The Serengeti Heritage Reserve stretched endlessly under October's punishing sun, its golden grasslands dotted with acacia trees that looked like nature's umbrellas. This was the dry season, when animals gathered desperately around shrinking water sources, their survival distilled to the most basic equation: find water or die. Margaret found a bitter poetry in that simplicity. Her own equation had become equally stark since Robert's death and Sarah's abandonment. Chief Ranger Joseph Mbeki, a weathered Tanzanian in his 60s, had welcomed her with genuine warmth that made Samuel's coldness even more pronounced. "American doctors are always welcome here," Mbeki had said, shaking her hand with both of his. "We have too few medical resources for our wildlife." He'd shown her to a modest tent equipped with basic amenities, 40 miles from the nearest town, 6 hours from the nearest hospital. Perfect isolation for what she'd planned. That first evening, as Margaret unpacked her medical bag with its hidden cargo of deliverance, she'd watched the sunset paint the savannah in shades of gold and crimson. Tomorrow, she'd decided, after helping with whatever medical needs arose, she would take her final walk into the wilderness Robert had always dreamed of seeing. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when the crackling radio shattered the camp's peaceful silence. Margaret was sipping instant coffee from a tin cup, watching zebras graze in the distance, when Chief Ranger Mbecky's urgent voice cut through the static. "Samuel, we've got a situation at the North Watering Hole. Pregnant lioness in distress. Been in labor for over 18 hours by our count." Samuel's response was immediate and cold. "Nature takes its course, Chief. We don't interfere with natural selection." Margaret set down her cup, something stirring in her chest, the same instinct that had driven her through 30 years of emergency medicine. 18 hours! That's dangerously long for any mammal. "This isn't a hospital, Doctor," Samuel replied without looking at her. "We're conservationists, not veterinarians." But Mbecky's voice crackled again with growing concern. "It's Amara, the lioness we've been tracking for 3 years. She's the last breeding female in this territory. Lost her previous litter to territorial males 6 months ago. If we lose her—" The weight of that statement hung in the morning air. Margaret understood the implications even without Samuel's grudging explanation that followed. The local pride will die out. 20 years of conservation work gone. Despite his harsh words, Margaret caught something else in Samuel's voice, genuine pain at the thought of losing Amara. She'd heard that same tone in her own voice countless times, discussing patients she knew she couldn't save but refused to abandon. "I could help," Margaret offered quietly. "I've delivered hundreds of babies. Emergency cesareans, breech births, complications you wouldn't believe. The principles are the same." Samuel's laugh was bitter. "Principles? You think your American medical degree makes you qualified to operate on a wild lioness?" His eyes flashed with something deeper than professional disagreement. "Some lives aren't worth the risk of intervention, Doctor. Some people learn that lesson too late." The personal edge in his voice puzzled Margaret, but she pressed on. "That lioness is suffering. If there's something I can do—" "There's nothing you can do," Samuel cut her off. "Just like there's nothing anyone can do when the system fails people who can't afford American medicine." The strange hostility in his words hung between them like a challenge, but before Margaret could respond, Mbecky's voice returned with increased urgency. "Samuel, I'm overruling you on this one. Dr. Thompson, if you're willing to try, we need to move now. Our nearest veterinarian is 200 miles away, and our radio to the main station is down for repairs." Margaret felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that had carried her through countless emergencies. For the first time in 18 months, someone needed her skills, not her sympathy, not her retirement planning, but the steady hands and quick thinking that had defined her identity for decades. "I'll need basic surgical supplies," she said, already mentally cataloging what she'd brought in her medical bag. "Sterile gloves, antiseptic, something for anesthesia if we have it." "We have a basic veterinary kit," Samuel said reluctantly. "But doctor, if you kill that lioness, you'll destroy 3 years of conservation work and possibly the future of lions in this region." Margaret met his challenging stare. "And if I do nothing, she dies anyway." The drive to the watering hole took 20 minutes across increasingly rough terrain. Samuel drove in tense silence while Margaret reviewed everything she could remember about large animal anatomy from her veterinary rotation 40 years earlier. The similarities to human birth were reassuring, but the differences, the size, the power, the unpredictability of a wild animal in pain, made her hands shake slightly. "Why do you hate me?" Margaret finally asked as they bounced over a particularly rough patch. "You've been hostile since the moment we met, and I don't understand why." Samuel's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "Some people don't deserve understanding, Doctor. Some people just deserve to face the consequences of their choices. Before Margaret could respond, they crested a small hill and saw her, Amara. The lioness lay on her side beneath a lone acacia tree, her golden coat dark with sweat and dirt. Even from 50 yards away, Margaret could see the animal's labored breathing, the way her powerful muscles contracted uselessly with each failed attempt to deliver her cubs. "Jesus," Margaret whispered, her doctor's instincts overriding everything else. "She's been pushing against an obstruction." "Look at the way she's positioned. That's a breech presentation if I've ever seen one." Samuel parked the Land Cruiser at a safe distance, but his expression had shifted from hostility to grudging respect. "You can tell that from here?" 30 years of emergency medicine teaches you to read a patient's body language, Margaret replied, already reaching for her medical bag. Hidden beneath the morphine vials and suicide notes she'd never send, her hands found the familiar weight of surgical instruments she'd carried halfway around the world. For the first time since Robert's death, Dr. Margaret Thompson felt like herself again. The moment Margaret approached Amara with her medical bag, Samuel's radio crackled to life with a sound that made both of them freeze. Vehicle engines growing closer. Samuel's face went pale as he adjusted the frequency. "Poachers," he whispered, scanning the horizon. "They track pregnant females. Cubs sell for 30,000 each on the black market." Margaret's blood chilled, but not from fear of the approaching danger. As she knelt beside the laboring lioness, studying the animal's exhausted golden eyes, a memory surfaced like a surgeon's nightmare. Those same eyes, but human, dark with pain and speaking broken English in a sterile Minneapolis emergency room. "Doctor, please," the woman had whispered. "My son, he's all I have." Samuel suddenly went rigid beside her, his breathing shallow. When Margaret looked up, she found him staring at her with an expression of dawning recognition that made her stomach drop. "Minneapolis General Hospital," he said quietly, his voice carrying 20 years of buried pain. "October 15th, 2004. Third shift, emergency room." The medical bag slipped from Margaret's hands. "Rebecca Mitchell," she whispered, the name surfacing from the depths of her memory like a confession. "Your mother. You remember." Samuel's voice was barely controlled, years of resentment finally finding their target. 20 years. I've wondered if you even cared enough to remember her name." Margaret's hands trembled as the memory flooded back. A young Tanzanian woman, brought in too late with complications from what should have been routine surgery. Language barriers, insurance issues, a system that had failed her long before she reached Margaret's emergency room. "Samuel, I tried everything." "You tried everything?" His voice cracked with decades of suppressed rage. "You worked on her for what? An hour? 2? Then you came out and told me we did everything we could like she was just another case number." Amara's labored breathing reminded them both that time was running out, but Samuel couldn't stop the words that had been building for 20 years. "I brought her to America because people said American doctors could save anyone if you had enough money. I worked 3 jobs, saved every penny for 5 years to bring her to Minneapolis for treatment. The best health care in the world, they said." His laugh was bitter. "She died anyway, in your emergency room, under your care." Margaret felt the familiar weight of every patient she'd lost, but this one carried a face, a name, a son who'd spent 2 decades hating her. The cancer had spread too far. By the time she reached us, by the time she reached you, she'd been fighting for treatment for 6 months, Samuel interrupted. 6 months of being told her English wasn't good enough, her insurance wasn't good enough, her life wasn't worth the same emergency care you'd give a suburban housewife. The sound of approaching vehicles grew louder, but neither of them moved. Amara's contractions were growing weaker, her strength failing, and Margaret realized she was watching another life slip away while the past held her paralyzed. "You want to know what she said before she died?" Samuel's voice broke. she said. "Tell my son I'm proud of him. Tell him to be better than the people who gave up on us." Margaret's chest tightened with more than just the memory. Samuel, I never gave up on her. I stayed with her for 18 hours straight. I called in specialists, tried experimental treatments that weren't even approved yet. I held her hand when she died because you were sleeping in the waiting room, and I couldn't bear the thought of her dying alone. Samuel's expression wavered, confusion replacing certainty. 18 hours? The hospital said... The hospital said what they legally had to say, Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the tears. But I broke protocol for your mother. I used medications that could have cost me my license. I stayed past 3 shift changes because I couldn't accept that a woman your age was going to die from something we might have cured if she'd been diagnosed 6 months earlier. The radio crackled again. Chief Mbeki's urgent voice. "Samuel, we're picking up multiple poacher vehicles heading your way. You need to move Amara now or hide her." But Samuel was staring at Margaret with an expression she recognized, the same look she'd seen on countless family members when they realized the full scope of what had been tried, what had been sacrificed, what had been lost despite everyone's best efforts. "She asked about you," Margaret continued softly. "Your mother. She said her son was studying to be a teacher, that he wanted to come back to Tanzania someday to protect the animals. She made me promise that if anything happened to her, someone would tell you that she believed you'd make a difference in the world." Amara's breathing was becoming more labored, her strength visibly fading. The approaching vehicles were now close enough that they could hear voices, rough, urgent, discussing the value of lion cubs. "I came here to die, Samuel," Margaret said quietly, her hand moving instinctively to her medical bag where the morphine waited. "I've lost everything that mattered to me. My husband, my daughter, my purpose. I thought maybe in the middle of nowhere my death wouldn't hurt anyone else." Samuel looked at her with new eyes, seeing not the enemy he'd built up in his mind, but a woman carrying her own unbearable weight of loss and guilt. "But I can't watch another life slip away when I might be able to save it," Margaret continued, reaching for her surgical gloves. "Even if you hate me, even if I fail, I have to try." The sound of gunshots in the distance made them both flinch. The poachers were getting closer, and Amara was running out of time. "Dr. Thompson," Samuel said quietly, his voice carrying a different tone than she'd heard before, "my mother would want you to save this lioness." For the first time in 20 years, Samuel Mitchell and Margaret Thompson were on the same side of a fight for life. The makeshift surgical area under the acacia tree looked nothing like the sterile operating rooms where Margaret had spent her career, but desperation had a way of making the impossible seem routine. Samuel spread a tarp on the ground while Margaret laid out her instruments with the methodical precision that had saved countless lives in Minneapolis emergency rooms. "I need you to translate if I'm talking too fast," Margaret said, pulling on surgical gloves with hands that had steadied considerably since accepting the challenge before them. "And I need you to watch for those poachers while I work." Samuel nodded, positioning himself where he could monitor both the horizon and Margaret's work. "What do you need me to do?" "Talk to her," Margaret said, surprising him. "Animals respond to calm voices just like humans do. Tell her what's happening in Swahili. Lions understand tone, even if they don't understand words." Margaret approached Amara slowly, her movements deliberate and non-threatening. The lioness's golden eyes tracked her approach, but there was something almost human in that gaze, exhaustion, pain, and perhaps recognition that this strange creature might be trying to help. "Pol sana, Mama," Samuel said softly to the lioness, his voice carrying the gentleness Margaret had never heard before. "This woman is going to help you." Margaret began her examination, her experienced hands reading the lioness's condition like a medical text she'd studied for decades. "The cub is definitely breech," she murmured, her fingers tracing the outline of the unborn lion through Amara's distended abdomen. The positioning is preventing natural delivery. Without intervention, both mother and cub will die. As she worked, Margaret found herself talking to Amara the way she'd talked to thousands of patients over the years. "I know you're scared, honey. I know this hurts more than anything you've ever felt, but we're going to get your baby out safely, okay? You just need to trust me for a little while longer." Samuel watched this interaction with growing amazement. The woman he'd hated for 20 years was showing the same gentle compassion he remembered from his mother's stories about the few medical professionals who had treated her with dignity. "Your mother told me about you," Margaret continued, her hands never stopping their careful work. "She said you were the strongest person she knew, that you'd inherited her fighting spirit. I see that now." The radio crackled with Chief Mbecki's voice. "Samuel, we've got 3 poacher vehicles approximately 2 miles from your position and closing. Military patrol is 40 minutes out. Hey, you need to finish whatever you're doing and get out of there." 40 minutes, Samuel repeated quietly to Margaret. "Can you deliver the cub in 40 minutes? Margaret's hands paused for just a moment. In a proper hospital with proper equipment and anesthesia, this would be a delicate but manageable procedure. Here, with improvised tools and a wild animal who couldn't understand what was happening to her, 40 minutes might as well be 40 seconds. "I don't know," she admitted. "But we're committed now. If we stop, she dies. If we run, she dies. The only chance any of us have is to see this through." She reached into her medical bag for the emergency cesarean kit she'd never expected to use on a lioness. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd brought these instruments for human emergencies, never imagining they'd be used to save an animal that represented everything wild and untouchable about Africa. "Samuel, I need you to help me position her," Margaret said. "We need to create a sterile field as much as possible, and I need you to keep her calm while I make the incision." Working together, they managed to clean and prepare the surgical area. Margaret's movements were sure and practiced, her 30 years of emergency medicine taking over despite the surreal circumstances. Samuel held Amara's massive head in his hands, stroking her mane and speaking to her in the gentle Swahili that seemed to soothe her labored breathing. "You know," Margaret said as she prepared the local anesthetic, "your mother talked about you constantly during those 18 hours. She told me you were in Detroit studying wildlife management. She said you'd written to her about wanting to come back to Tanzania to protect the animals she remembered from her childhood." Samuel's voice was thick with emotion. "She never told me about that conversation. She was proud of you for choosing a different path than she had," Margaret continued, her hands working with steady precision. "She said too many people from her generation had to leave Tanzania to find opportunities, but you were going to bring your education back home to protect what mattered." The first incision was clean and precise, Margaret's muscle memory guiding her hands even as her conscious mind marveled at the surreal nature of performing surgery on a lioness in the middle of the Serengeti. Amara's breathing remained steady, the local anesthetic and Samuel's calming presence keeping her remarkably still for such a powerful predator. "I can see the cub," Margaret announced, her voice carrying the same excitement she'd felt at hundreds of human deliveries. "Samuel, look at this. It's perfectly formed. We just need to turn it around and guide it out." The delicate work of repositioning the cub required all of Margaret's surgical experience. One wrong move could injure both mother and baby, but the alternative was certain death for both. Samuel watched in fascination as Margaret's hands worked with the confidence of someone who had performed similar procedures countless times, even if never under quite these circumstances. "Talk to me about your mother," Margaret said as she worked, her voice steady despite the complexity of the procedure. "Tell me what she was like when you were growing up." Samuel's eyes remained fixed on the horizon, watching for poachers, but his voice grew soft with memory. "She was the strongest person I ever knew." Lost her husband when I was 5, raised me alone, worked 3 jobs to send money to her parents, and still managed to save enough to bring us both to America when I was 15. She told me about those jobs, Margaret replied, her hands never pausing in their careful work. Cleaning offices at night, working in a hotel laundry during the day, taking care of an elderly man on weekends. She said she did it all because she believed America would give you opportunities Tanzania couldn't. And then the healthcare system failed her anyway, Samuel said bitterly. No, Margaret replied firmly, surprising him with the sharpness in her voice. The system failed her long before she got to my emergency room. By the time I met your mother, she'd been fighting breast cancer for 8 months without proper treatment because she couldn't afford early screening, couldn't navigate the insurance maze, couldn't find doctors who would take her seriously. Margaret paused in her work, looking directly at Samuel. I spent 18 hours fighting for your mother's life, Samuel. I called in favors, broke protocols, used experimental treatments that weren't approved for her condition. I did everything humanly possible because she reminded me of every patient I'd ever lost to a system that values wealth over human life. The cub was finally in the correct position, and Margaret began the delicate process of delivery. But in the end, the cancer had progressed too far. Sometimes, no matter how hard you fight, no matter how much you care, medicine isn't magic. Sometimes people die despite everyone's best efforts. Samuel's radio crackled again. 2 miles and closing. You've got maybe 20 minutes before they reach your position. The cub is crowning, Margaret announced, her voice filled with the wonder that had never left her despite decades of medical practice. Samuel, I need you to help me guide it out. Working together, they carefully delivered the lion cub, a perfect, tiny predator covered in the fluids of birth but unmistakably alive. Margaret quickly cleared its airway and stimulated breathing while Samuel watched in amazement. It's breathing, Samuel whispered, wonder replacing the bitterness that had defined him for 20 years. Dr. Thompson, it's actually breathing. But their celebration was cut short by the sound of gunshots, much closer now. The poachers had found their trail, and the military patrol was still 20 minutes away. We need to move, Samuel said urgently, but Margaret was already working on closing the surgical incision. 5 more minutes, she said. I can't leave her like this. She'll bleed out. Samuel looked at the woman who had spent 20 years as the focus of his hatred and saw instead someone willing to risk her life for a patient she'd met 20 minutes ago. The same dedication that had kept her fighting for his mother's life for 18 hopeless hours was now driving her to finish what she'd started with Amara. Dr. Thompson, he said quietly, my mother would be proud of what you're doing. As Margaret put in the final sutures, Amara lifted her massive head and looked directly at her with eyes that seemed to convey understanding, gratitude, and trust. The newborn cub mewled softly, already seeking its mother's warmth. There, Margaret said, stripping off her surgical gloves. She should recover fully if she can avoid infection. But as they packed up the medical supplies, the sound of approaching vehicles grew unmistakably closer. Samuel grabbed his rifle and positioned himself between the lioness family and the direction of the approaching threat. Dr. Thompson, he said, his voice carrying new respect, I think we're about to find out just how far you're willing to go to protect a patient. The first gunshot shattered the afternoon stillness, sending a flock of weaver birds exploding from the acacia tree above them. Margaret instinctively threw herself over the newborn cub while Amara struggled to rise, her maternal instincts overriding the weakness from surgery and blood loss. Stay down, Samuel hissed, shouldering his rifle as 3 battered Toyota pickups crested the ridge 200 yards away. Through his binoculars, he could make out at least 8 men armed with automatic weapons and tranquilizer guns. Professional operation? They're not here to negotiate. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as she crouched beside Amara, one hand protectively over the cub, while the other pressed against the lioness's sutured incision. 20 minutes ago, She'd been ready to die by her own hand in these same grasslands. Now, faced with armed poachers who would kill her without hesitation, she discovered something startling. She desperately wanted to live. "Can you walk?" she whispered to Amara, knowing the lioness couldn't understand but needing to voice her concern. The big cat's golden eyes were alert but pained, her powerful muscles trembling with the effort of remaining upright so soon after surgery. The lead vehicle stopped 50 yards away, its engine still running. A heavy-set man with scarred hands and military-style clothing stepped out, assault rifle casual in his grip. His voice carried clearly across the grassland, speaking accented English mixed with Swahili. "American doctor," he called out, his tone almost conversational. "We know you are there. Bring us the lioness and cubs, and you can drive away. Simple business transaction." Samuel's radio crackled with Chief Mbeki's urgent whisper, "Military patrol 15 minutes out. Whatever you do, don't engage. Repeat, do not engage." 15 minutes, Samuel muttered to Margaret. "We just need to hold them off for 15 minutes. But Margaret was staring at Amara with the clinical assessment that had defined her career. The lioness was losing blood, her breathing becoming more labored. The stress of the confrontation was accelerating what should have been a slow, careful recovery. "She's not going to make it 15 minutes, Margaret whispered. "The surgical trauma, the blood loss, the stress. Her body is shutting down." The poacher leader fired a warning shot into the air. "American doctor, you have 1 minute to decide. Cubs are worth $60,000. Your life is worth nothing to us." Samuel chambered around, his military training evident in his smooth, practiced movements. "I can take out maybe 3 of them before they overwhelm us. Not great odds." "No," Margaret said firmly, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "No more shooting. No more violence." She stood up slowly, her hands raised, and walked into the open space between the acacia tree and the poacher's vehicles. Samuel cursed under his breath but didn't try to stop her. "I'm Dr. Margaret Thompson," she called out, her voice carrying across the grassland with the authority she'd once wielded in hospital corridors. "I've just performed emergency surgery on this lioness. She and her cub will die if they're moved now." The poacher leader laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "American doctors, always thinking you know better than everyone else. Move away from the animals, doctor. Last warning." "No," Margaret replied, planting her feet. At 67, having lost everything that once mattered to her, she discovered a courage she'd never known she possessed. "I've spent my entire career saving lives. I won't stop now." "Dr. Thompson," Samuel called urgently from behind the tree. "These men will kill you without hesitation." Margaret turned to look at him, and Samuel saw something in her eyes that made his breath catch, the same fierce determination he remembered from his mother's stories about the American doctor who had fought 18 hours to save her life. "Samuel," Margaret said quietly, "I came to Africa to die, but I realize now that's not what I want anymore. I want to live. I want to matter. And if I'm going to die anyway, I'd rather die protecting something beautiful than letting these men destroy it." She turned back to the poachers, pulling something from her medical bag. Samuel's blood went cold as he recognized the morphine vials, enough to kill her instantly if injected. "This lioness represents 3 years of conservation work," Margaret announced, holding up the vials. "Her cubs are the future of this pride. You want them? You'll have to kill me first. And if you kill me, I've got enough morphine here to euthanize both mother and cubs before I die. Nobody gets anything." The standoff stretched for endless seconds. Amara, somehow sensing the protection Margaret was offering, struggled to her feet and positioned herself beside the human woman. The newborn cub mewled softly from the grass between them. "You're bluffing," the poacher leader said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Try me," Margaret replied. "I'm a surgeon. I know exactly where to inject to make death instantaneous. You'll get nothing but corpses." Samuel watched this exchange with growing amazement. The woman he'd hated for 20 years was putting her life between armed criminals and a wild animal she'd met hours ago. More than that, she was using her medical knowledge, the same expertise he'd blamed for his mother's death, as a weapon to protect life. The radio in the lead pickup crackled with urgent Swahili. Samuel caught enough to understand. Other ranger patrols were closing in. Military vehicles had been spotted. The operation was becoming too risky. "Boss!" one of the younger poachers called out nervously. "Too much heat. We should go." But the leader's eyes remained fixed on Margaret. $60,000, American doctor. Think about that number. More money than most Africans see in a lifetime. "I've got more money than I can spend," Margaret replied. "What I don't have is purpose. What I don't have is the chance to save something beautiful and wild and irreplaceable. This lioness and her cub, they're my purpose now." Behind her, Amara let out a low rumble that wasn't quite a growl, something closer to a purr. The sound of an adult lioness acknowledging an ally. Samuel felt tears sting his eyes as he realized what he was witnessing. The birth of a bond that transcended species, built on mutual protection and shared vulnerability. The distant sound of helicopters drifted across the grassland. Military patrol arriving early. The poacher leader's expression darkened as he calculated rapidly diminishing options. "This isn't over, American doctor," he called out, backing toward his vehicle. "These animals belong to Africa, not to foreign tourists playing at conservation." "You're right," Margaret replied, never moving from her protective stance beside Amara. "They belong to Africa. That's why they're staying here, with people who understand their real value." As the poacher vehicles disappeared over the ridge, Samuel emerged from behind the acacia tree and walked slowly toward Margaret. She was trembling now, adrenaline finally catching up with her, but her hands remained steady as she checked Amara's surgical site. "Dr. Thompson," Samuel said quietly, "that was either the bravest or the stupidest thing I've ever seen." Margaret looked up at him with a smile that transformed her entire face. "Sometimes they're the same thing." She knelt beside Amara, gently examining the newborn cub. Strong heartbeat, good muscle tone, already trying to nurse. "This little one is going to make it." "Because of you," Samuel said. "Because of us," Margaret corrected. "Your mother was right, Samuel. You did come back to protect what matters, and you've helped me remember why I became a doctor in the first place." As the military helicopters appeared on the horizon, Samuel's radio crackled with Chief Mbeki's relieved voice. "Samuel, are you secure? Report your status." "Secure, Chief," Samuel replied, watching Margaret tend to her patient with the gentle competence that had defined her career. "More than secure. We're exactly where we need to be." Margaret looked up from checking Amara's vital signs and met Samuel's eyes. "I think your mother would approve of how this turned out." "I think she would," Samuel agreed. "And Dr. Thompson, thank you for saving her 20 years ago and for saving them today." The sound of approaching rescue vehicles mixed with the contented purring of a lioness recovering from surgery while her newborn cub found its first meal. In the golden light of late afternoon, the circle of life and death and redemption felt complete. The celebration was brief. As the military helicopters circled overhead and the immediate danger from poachers faded, Margaret felt her chest constrict with a familiar, terrifying pressure. Her heart medication, precisely timed for 40 years of cardiac management, was wearing off at the worst possible moment. "Samuel," she gasped, one hand pressed against her sternum while the other instinctively reached for Amara's steady breathing form. "Something's wrong." The pain hit like a sledgehammer, radiating down her left arm with the textbook precision of a massive cardiac event. Margaret had diagnosed this exact scenario in hundreds of patients over her career, but experiencing it herself was a revelation of terror she'd never anticipated. "Dr. Thompson!" Samuel's voice seemed to come from very far away as Margaret's vision began to tunnel. She collapsed beside Amara, her body betraying her just moments after her greatest triumph. Samuel was immediately on his radio, his military training overriding panic. "Chief, we need immediate medical evacuation. Dr. Thompson is having what looks like a heart attack." Through the static came Mbeki's urgent response. "Nearest hospital is 6 hours by road, 2 hours by helicopter. Medical team is en route, but Samuel, 2 hours might be too long." Margaret's breathing became shallow and rapid. The irony wasn't lost on her. Even through the crushing chest pain, she'd saved Amara's life only to lose her own to the same heart condition that had been quietly killing her for months. The cardiac episodes she'd been ignoring, dismissing as grief-related stress, were finally demanding their due. "My medical bag," she whispered to Samuel, her voice barely audible over the sound of approaching helicopters. "Nitroglycerin. In the side pocket." Samuel fumbled through her supplies, his hand shaking as he searched for the medication that might buy them precious time. Instead, his fingers closed around the morphine vials she'd threatened the poachers with, the same lethal dose she'd originally brought to end her own suffering. "Margaret," he said urgently, using her first name for the first time, "where's the nitroglycerin?" But Margaret's eyes were closing, her skin taking on the grayish pallor that Samuel had seen too many times in combat medics' tents. Her pulse was becoming thready and irregular, the classic signs of a heart shutting down under overwhelming stress. What happened next defied every piece of wildlife training Samuel had ever received. Amara, weakened from surgery and still bleeding internally, struggled to her feet and moved to Margaret's side. The massive lioness, who should have been focused entirely on her newborn cub, instead lay down next to the unconscious human woman. "What are you doing?" Samuel whispered, torn between protecting Margaret from a wild predator and recognizing something unprecedented in Amara's behavior. The lioness began grooming Margaret's hair with her rough tongue, the same gentle cleaning motion she would use on her own cubs. Her warm body pressed against Margaret's side, sharing body heat that Margaret's failing circulation could no longer maintain. Samuel's radio crackled. "Medical team landing in 2 minutes. What's her condition?" "Unconscious, pulse weak and irregular, possible massive cardiac event," Samuel reported, his eyes never leaving the extraordinary scene before him. "And Chief, the lioness is... she's protecting her. Samuel, you need to move that animal away from the patient before the medical team arrives." "No," Samuel said firmly, surprising himself. "The lioness is keeping her warm, keeping her stable. I'm not moving her." The military medical team that rappelled from the helicopter stopped short at the sight that greeted them, an unconscious elderly woman being tenderly guarded by a lioness that had clearly just given birth. The lead medic, a grizzled veteran named Captain Rodriguez, had seen combat in 3 theaters of war, but nothing quite like this. "Sir," he called to Samuel, "we can't approach the patient with that animal present." "The lioness won't hurt you," Samuel replied. "Dr. Thompson saved her life. I think she understands what's happening." As if responding to his words, Amara looked up at the approaching medical team and moved slightly away from Margaret, but remained close enough to watch protectively. Her newborn cub mewled softly from where it lay pressed against Margaret's unconscious form. The medics worked with efficient speed, starting IV lines and connecting cardiac monitors, while Amara watched every movement with intelligent, concerned eyes. Margaret's vital signs were critical: blood pressure dangerously low, heart rhythm chaotic, oxygen saturation dropping despite supplemental support. "We need to get her to Nairobi General immediately," Captain Rodriguez announced. "She's got maybe an hour before this becomes irreversible." As they prepared to move Margaret to the helicopter, something extraordinary happened. Amara stood carefully, picked up her newborn cub in her mouth, and placed it gently on Margaret's chest. The tiny lion settled against the unconscious woman's heartbeat, its own rapid breathing somehow synchronizing with Margaret's labored respirations. "I've never seen anything like this," the medic whispered. "It's like she's trying to give something back." Samuel felt tears streaming down his face as he realized what he was witnessing. The same fierce loyalty his mother had shown, the same protective instinct that transcended species and circumstance. Amara, in her own way, was refusing to let the woman who had saved her life die alone. The helicopter lifted off into the golden African sunset with Margaret Thompson unconscious and failing, but somehow no longer alone in her fight for life. The cardiac unit at Nairobi General Hospital had seen its share of miracles, but nothing quite prepared Dr. James Kiprotich for the phone call that would change everything he thought he knew about medicine and human connection. "Dr. Kiprotich." Samuel's voice crackled through the satellite phone from the Serengeti. "I need you to understand something before you treat Dr. Thompson. She came here to die. This heart attack. It's not just a medical emergency. It's the culmination of 18 months of grief and guilt that's been killing her slowly." Margaret had been unconscious for 36 hours. The cardiac damage was extensive. A widowmaker heart attack complicated by months of untreated smaller episodes she'd ignored in her depression. Her daughter Sarah was flying in from Boston, but the prognosis remained grim. What Dr. Kiprotich hadn't expected was the phone call that came at 3 a.m. on Margaret's second night in intensive care. "This is Dr. Sarah Thompson." The voice was crisp, professional, and furious. "I'm calling about my mother, Margaret Thompson. I want to know why she was in Tanzania instead of proper medical care, and I want to know who convinced a 67-year-old woman with cardiac issues to play veterinarian in the middle of nowhere." Samuel, who had driven 12 hours straight to reach Nairobi, took the phone from Dr. Kiprotich with trembling hands. "Dr. Thompson, this is Samuel Mitchell. I was with your mother when she collapsed." "Are you the tour guide responsible for this disaster?" Sarah's voice cut through the phone like a scalpel. "Do you have any idea what you've done? My mother could die because of your negligence." "Your mother saved 2 lives yesterday," Samuel replied quietly. "A lioness and her cub that would have died without her intervention. She chose to risk everything for something she believed in." "She's a 70-year-old woman with heart disease." Sarah's professional composure was cracking. "She has no business performing surgery on wild animals. She should be in assisted living, not playing out some ridiculous fantasy in Africa." The words hit Samuel like physical blows. This was exactly the conversation he imagined his own mother having if roles were reversed. Family members who thought they knew what was best, who couldn't understand the choice to risk everything for something meaningful. "Dr. Thompson," Samuel said carefully, "your mother told me that you two haven't spoken since your father's funeral. Is that true?" The silence on the other end stretched for long seconds. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was smaller, more vulnerable. That's not relevant to her medical care." "I think it is," Samuel pressed gently. "Your mother came to Tanzania to die. She brought enough morphine to end her life because she believed she had nothing left to live for. The fact that she's fighting this heart attack instead of letting go, that's because she found something worth living for." Through the phone, Samuel could hear Sarah crying. She brought morphine to... "She saved a life yesterday," Samuel continued. "For the first time in 18 months, she felt like herself again. Like the doctor who spent her entire career fighting for patients everyone else had given up on." Dr. Kiprotich, who had been listening to this conversation, took the phone. "Dr. Thompson? This is Dr. Kiprotich, your mother's cardiologist. I need you to know that your mother's condition is critical, but she's fighting in a way that's unusual for someone with this level of cardiac damage. There's something driving her to survive that I've rarely seen in my 30 years of practice." The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Margaret's intensive care unit. Samuel had maintained a vigil beside her bed, watching the monitors that tracked her fragile hold on life, when Chief Mbeki arrived with news that would have been impossible to believe under normal circumstances. "The lioness," Mbeki said quietly, settling into the uncomfortable hospital chair beside Samuel. "Amara, she's not eating. Won't leave the spot where the helicopter took Dr. Thompson. Joseph says she's calling, not roaring, but making sounds he's never heard before. Like she's grieving." Samuel stared at Margaret's unconscious form, her face pale against the white hospital linens. "Animals don't grieve for humans, Chief. Animals don't usually let humans perform surgery on them either," Mbeki replied. "But Amara did. She trusted Dr. Thompson with her life and her cub's life. That kind of trust doesn't just disappear." The revelation that would change everything came that afternoon when Dr. Kiprotich was reviewing Margaret's complete medical records, which had finally arrived from Minneapolis General Hospital. Hidden in the files was documentation that painted a completely different picture of Margaret's final years in practice. "Samuel," Dr. Kiprotich called urgently. "You need to see this, Dr. Thompson's personnel file from Minneapolis General. Look at this notation from October 2004. Samuel read the official hospital documentation with growing amazement. Margaret had been formally reprimanded for excessive involvement in patient care after staying with Rebecca Mitchell for 18 consecutive hours. She had used her own medical insurance to cover experimental treatments not approved by Rebecca's insurance. She had paid for Rebecca's funeral expenses from her personal account. "She never told me," Samuel whispered, his voice breaking. 20 years I've hated her, and she never once defended herself." But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. At the bottom of Rebecca's file was a handwritten note in Margaret's medical writing. "Patient son Samuel studying wildlife management at University of Michigan. Patient expressed desire for son to return to Tanzania for conservation work. If patient expires, please ensure son receives scholarship fund information." Attached was documentation of a $50,000 educational fund Margaret had established in Rebecca Mitchell's name, designated specifically for Tanzanian students pursuing wildlife conservation degrees. The fund had paid for scholarships for 12 students over 20 years, including the advanced training that had qualified Samuel for his current position as head ranger. Samuel's hands shook as he realized the truth. Every opportunity he'd had since his mother's death, every door that had opened in his conservation career had been quietly funded by the woman he'd spent 2 decades hating. "She's been taking care of you for 20 years, Dr. Kiprotich said softly. "Even when you hated her, even when she could have told you the truth and earned your forgiveness." The sound of rapid footsteps in the corridor announced Sarah's arrival. She burst through the ICU doors looking exactly like her mother, same gray-blue eyes, same determined jawline, same physician's posture that commanded respect in medical settings. But when Sarah saw her mother's unconscious form connected to life support machines, her professional composure shattered completely. "Oh God, Mom!" "What have I done?" Samuel stood quietly as Sarah took her mother's hand, whispering apologies for 18 months of silence, for harsh words spoken in grief, for refusing to understand that Margaret's dedication to saving lives had never been about choosing medicine over family. "She called me," Sarah said through tears, speaking to Samuel without looking up from her mother's face. "The night before she left for Tanzania, she said she wanted to make peace, wanted to explain about Dad's final months. I hung up on her. I actually hung up on my own mother." The monitors showed Margaret's vital signs remaining critically unstable, but something in her breathing pattern seemed to change as Sarah spoke. Dr. Kiprotich noted increased brain activity on the EEG, suggesting that Margaret might be processing the sounds around her even in her unconscious state. "Talk to her," Samuel encouraged Sarah. "Tell her what she needs to hear." Sarah squeezed her mother's hand tighter. Mom, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for blaming you for Dad's suffering. You were trying to give us more time together, and I was too angry to see that. You've spent your whole life saving people, and I punished you for trying to save the person we both loved most. The heart monitor showed a subtle but significant change. Margaret's rhythm becoming more regular, her blood pressure stabilizing slightly. For the first time in 48 hours, Dr. Kiprotic saw genuine hope for recovery. "Samuel," Sarah said, finally looking up from her mother's bedside, "tell me about the lioness. Tell me about what Mom did out there." As Samuel recounted the story of Margaret's courage, her refusal to abandon Amara despite mortal danger, Sarah began to understand something she'd missed for 18 months. Her mother hadn't lost her purpose when Robert died. She'd simply been waiting for the right moment to remember who she'd always been. Outside Nairobi General Hospital, the African sunrise painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the same colors that had witnessed a miracle of trust between species in the Serengeti grasslands. Margaret's eyes opened on the third day to a sight that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. Her daughter Sarah, asleep in the uncomfortable hospital chair, one hand still clutching Margaret's fingers, while Samuel sat quietly in the corner reading wildlife conservation journals aloud in the gentle voice she remembered from the savannah. The latest research from the Serengeti Conservation Area, Samuel was reading, indicates that successful lioness births in protected territories have increased by 30% over the past 5 years, largely due to improved veterinary intervention protocols. "Is that your way of telling me I'm not the first crazy American to perform surgery on a lion?" Margaret's voice was barely a whisper, but it was enough to startle both Sarah and Samuel awake. "Mom!" Sarah's professional composure evaporated as she threw her arms around her mother, tears streaming down her face. "Don't you ever scare me like that again. Don't you ever leave me like that again." Margaret's arms, weak from 3 days of cardiac recovery, managed to circle her daughter's shoulders. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I'm so sorry for everything. For keeping Dad alive too long. For making you watch him suffer. For giving up on us when I should have been fighting for us." "No, Mom," Sarah said firmly, pulling back to look into her mother's eyes. "I'm the one who's sorry. I blamed you for trying to save the man we both loved. I punished you for being exactly the doctor, exactly the person I'd always admired. I was angry at God, at cancer, at the unfairness of losing Dad, and I took it out on the one person who fought hardest to keep him with us." Samuel cleared his throat gently. "Dr. Thompson, there are some things you need to know. About your mother, about the last 20 years, about why I was so angry when we met." Margaret listened in growing amazement as Samuel revealed the scholarship fund, the educational opportunities, the quiet support that had shaped his entire career. When he finished, she was crying. Not from weakness or medication, but from the overwhelming realization that her life's work had mattered in ways she'd never imagined. "You never said anything," Samuel concluded. 20 years I hated you, and you never once told me the truth that would have changed everything." "Because it wouldn't have brought your mother back," Margaret replied softly. "And because hate is sometimes easier to carry than gratitude. I didn't want you to feel obligated to forgive me." Dr. Kiprotic appeared in the doorway with news that transformed the emotional reunion into something approaching the miraculous. "Dr. Thompson, I've just received the most unusual call in my 30 years of practice. It's from Chief Mbeki at the Serengeti Reserve. He says Amara, the lioness you operated on, is apparently refusing to eat unless someone plays recordings of your voice." The room fell silent as the implications of this news settled in. Margaret, still weak from her cardiac event, struggled to process what she was hearing. "They've been playing recordings from Samuel's radio calls during the surgery," Dr. Kiprotich continued. "Whenever Amara hears your voice, She eats normally, cares for her cub, behaves like a healthy lioness. Without the recordings, she becomes listless, stops eating, and shows signs of what can only be described as grief. Sarah, her medical training warring with the impossibility of what she was hearing, asked the question they were all thinking. Animals don't form emotional attachments to humans they've met once. That's not how wildlife behavior works. No, Samuel agreed, it's not. But then again, wild lionesses don't usually let humans perform surgery on them either. Amara experienced something unprecedented, complete vulnerability followed by life-saving intervention. The bond that formed isn't something textbooks can explain. The video call that followed challenged everything Margaret thought she understood about the boundaries between human and animal consciousness. Chief Mbeki's tablet showed Amara lying beneath the same acacia tree where Margaret had performed the surgery, her cub healthy and growing, but the lioness herself visibly distressed. "Watch this," Mbeki said, activating a recording of Margaret's voice from the surgery. "I know you're scared, honey. I know this hurts more than anything you've ever felt. But we're going to get your baby out safely, okay?" Amara's response was immediate and unmistakable. Her ears perked up, her breathing settled, and she began grooming her cub with renewed vigor. When the recording ended, she looked directly at the camera with intelligent eyes that seemed to be searching for something. "She's looking for you," Samuel said quietly. "She knows your voice, but she's trying to find your face." Margaret, against all medical advice and Dr. Kiprotich's protests, struggled to sit up in her hospital bed. "Put the tablet where she can see me." What happened next defied every principle of wildlife behavior that Samuel had studied. When Amara saw Margaret's face on the screen, she approached the tablet and began making the soft, chuffing sounds that lionesses use to communicate with their cubs, not quite purring, but the closest thing to contentment that a big cat could express. "Hello, beautiful girl," Margaret whispered to the screen, tears streaming down her face. "How's your baby?" "Are you taking good care of our little one?" Amara's response was to gently pick up her cub and bring it closer to the camera, as if presenting the healthy offspring to the human who had made its life possible. The cub, now 3 days old and growing strong, mewled softly at the sound of Margaret's voice. "This is impossible," Sarah said, her voice filled with wonder. "This is medically, scientifically, behaviorally impossible." "So was performing emergency surgery on a wild lioness," Margaret replied, never taking her eyes off Amara's face on the screen. "Sometimes, impossible things happen when love and desperation meet." The conversation that followed revealed the depth of transformation that had occurred not just in Margaret's relationship with her purpose, but in her understanding of what constituted family. Samuel spoke of his plans to establish a wildlife medical training program, combining traditional veterinary techniques with the kind of emergency medicine that had saved Amara's life. Sarah, watching her mother's renewed vitality, began discussing the possibility of taking a sabbatical from her Boston practice to work in Tanzania. "There's something else," Dr. Kiprotich interjected, consulting Margaret's latest cardiac tests. "Your heart function has improved dramatically over the past 48 hours. The level of recovery we're seeing is unusual for someone who suffered the extent of cardiac damage you experienced." Margaret smiled, her hand instinctively moving to her chest, where she could feel her heart beating stronger than it had in months. "I have something to live for now." That tends to be excellent medicine. The phone call that interrupted their reunion came from an unexpected source, the Tanzanian Minister of Wildlife Conservation, who had heard about the American doctor who had risked her life to save a lioness and wanted to discuss establishing an international wildlife medical exchange program. "Dr. Thompson," the minister's voice was warm with respect, Tanzania would be honored to offer you permanent residency and a position developing veterinary protocols for our conservation programs. Your expertise, combined with your demonstrated commitment to African wildlife, could save hundreds of animals over the coming years. Margaret looked at Sarah, then at Samuel, then at the tablet screen where Amara was still watching with patient, intelligent eyes. For the first time since Robert's death, she was being offered not just a job, but a calling that felt worthy of the years she had left. "I accept," Margaret said without hesitation. "On one condition. This program trains local Tanzanians as the primary veterinary conservationists. My role is to teach, not to replace." Samuel's smile lit up his entire face. "Dr. Thompson, my mother would be so proud. She always said the best doctors were the ones who made themselves unnecessary by teaching others to heal." As the afternoon sun streamed through the hospital windows, Margaret realized that she had found something she'd never expected in her journey toward suicide, a new definition of family. Sarah, who was already researching pediatric medicine applications for wildlife conservation, Samuel, who had transformed from enemy to son in the space of understanding, and Amara, whose trust had awakened Margaret's sleeping sense of purpose. The heart monitor beside Margaret's bed showed a rhythm that Dr. Kiprotich called textbook perfect, the steady, strong beat of a heart that had rediscovered its reason for continuing. Outside, Nairobi's bustling sounds mixed with the distant calls of birds, creating a symphony of life that Margaret Thompson was finally ready to join again. "When can I go home?" Margaret asked, though the word home now carried a meaning that encompassed both the daughter at her bedside and the lioness waiting for her voice in the African grasslands. "2 more days of monitoring," Dr. Kiprotich replied. "Then you can return to your lioness." Margaret closed her eyes and smiled, her hand still holding Sarah's, her heart beating strong and purposeful for the first time in 18 months. She had come to Africa to die, but instead, she had learned how to live again. 6 months later, Margaret Thompson stood in the golden light of an African sunrise, watching Amara teach her now adolescent cub to hunt in the tall grass of the Serengeti. The scar across her chest from emergency cardiac surgery had faded to a thin line, but the deeper healing, the restoration of purpose that had saved her life more surely than any medical intervention, glowed in every movement she made. The Rebecca Mitchell Wildlife Medical Center had become a reality beyond anything Margaret had imagined during those dark months after Robert's funeral. Built on a rise overlooking the watering hole where she'd first met Amara, the facility combined cutting-edge veterinary equipment with traditional Tanzanian healing wisdom, creating a training ground where young African conservationists learned alongside experienced international veterinarians. Dr. Thompson, called Dr. Jengo Masai, one of the 12 Tanzanian veterinary students who had graduated from the program's first class, "We have a radio call from the northern sector." "Elephant with complications during birth." Margaret smiled, checking her medical bag, the same one that had once carried morphine intended for her suicide, now filled with life-saving equipment that had become familiar friends over months of wildlife emergencies. "Tell them we're en route. And Jengo, you're taking the lead on this one." The young veterinarian's face lit up with the same expression Margaret remembered from her own early days in medicine, equal parts terror and exhilaration at being trusted with a life. It was a look she'd seen dozens of times now, reflected in the faces of students who were carrying African wildlife conservation into a new generation. Sarah emerged from the clinic's main building, her surgical scrubs dusty from a morning spent training local medical staff in emergency protocols that could be adapted from human medicine to wildlife care. Her sabbatical from Boston had stretched into a permanent relocation, drawn by work that felt more meaningful than anything she'd done in her previous practice. "Mom, before you head out," Sarah said, falling into step beside Margaret as they walked toward the Land Cruiser, "I got a call from the documentary crew. The footage of you and Amara during the surgery has been viewed 40 million times online. They want to interview you about what it's like to be 70 and starting a completely new career." Margaret paused, considering the strangeness of being internet famous at an age when most of her contemporaries were settling into retirement communities. "What would I tell them?" "The truth," Sarah replied simply. "That it's never too late to discover what you're actually meant to do with your life." The drive to the northern sector took them past landmarks that had become as familiar as the Minneapolis neighborhoods where Margaret had spent 4 decades. The acacia tree where she'd performed surgery on Amara now served as an unofficial shrine, visited by wildlife enthusiasts from around the world who came to see the place where an elderly American doctor had risked everything to save a lioness. Samuel's voice crackled over the radio as they drove. "Dr. Thompson, the elephant cow is about 12 years old, first-time mother. Calf appears to be in breech position. Local rangers have been monitoring for 6 hours." "How's her stress level?" Margaret asked, her mind already running through the checklist of considerations for large animal emergency surgery. "Surprisingly calm," Samuel replied. "It's almost like she's waiting for help instead of panicking. The matriarch of her herd seems to be keeping the other elephants at a distance, like she knows something's coming." Margaret and Sarah exchanged glances. Over the past 6 months, they'd encountered similar behavior in multiple species, animals that seemed to recognize the approach of medical help, that remained calmer during human intervention than wildlife behavior textbooks suggested was possible. "Word's getting around," Sarah said with a smile. "The wildlife network is more sophisticated than we gave it credit for." They found the elephant herd gathered around a massive female who lay on her side in obvious distress, her trunk reaching instinctively toward her swollen abdomen. The matriarch, an ancient elephant with tusks worn smooth by decades of survival, watched Margaret's approach with intelligent eyes that held no fear. "She's been in labor for 8 hours, reported Dr. Kesimwamba, the local ranger who had first spotted the struggling mother. "Calf's definitely malpositioned, but she's not showing the aggressive behavior we'd expect during a difficult birth." Margaret approached slowly, her movements deliberate and non-threatening, speaking in the same gentle voice she'd used with countless patients over 5 decades of medical practice. "Hello, beautiful. I know this is scary, but we're here to help you and your baby." The elephant's response was extraordinary. She extended her trunk toward Margaret, touching the human woman's face with the same gentle exploration that elephants used to greet family members. Around them, the herd maintained their protective circle, but showed no signs of the territorial aggression that typically accompanied human proximity to vulnerable elephants. "This is unprecedented," whispered Dr. Sarah Thompson, her voice filled with the wonder that had drawn her from pediatric surgery in Boston to wildlife medicine in Tanzania. "She's actively seeking human contact." The surgery that followed challenged every assumption about the boundaries between species. Working together, Margaret and her team of Tanzanian veterinarians managed to reposition the calf and guide it safely into the world, while the mother remained remarkably still, as if understanding that cooperation was essential for survival. When the baby elephant took its first breath and struggled to its feet, the matriarch let out a rumbling call that was answered by elephants across the savannah, a sound of celebration that seemed to acknowledge not just the birth of a new life, but the successful collaboration between human and animal communities. "Dr. Thompson," said Dr. Masai, his voice thick with emotion as he watched the newborn elephant take its first steps. "My grandmother told me stories about the old days when humans and animals lived in harmony. I never believed those stories until I started working with you." As they packed up their equipment, Margaret's satellite phone buzzed with a text message from an unexpected source, her former colleague, Dr. Patricia Williams from Minneapolis General Hospital. "Saw the documentary about your work in Tanzania. The entire cardiac surgery department is talking about you. We always knew you were special, but what you're doing now..." This is your true calling. Robert would be so proud." Margaret showed the message to Sarah, who smiled through tears. "Dad always said you were meant for something extraordinary. I just never imagined it would happen after everything fell apart." The drive back to the Rebecca Mitchell Wildlife Medical Center took them past familiar sights that had become home in ways Margaret never could have imagined during her darkest days in Minneapolis. Amara and her cub were visible near the watering hole, the adolescent lion practicing hunting skills while his mother watched with the patient attention of a devoted parent. "Pull over," Margaret asked Samuel, who was driving the return journey. "I want to check on our original patient." Amara's response to seeing Margaret was immediate and joyful, a series of chuffing calls that brought her cub running from his play. The young lion, now confident and strong, approached Margaret with the fearless curiosity of an animal that had never learned to fear humans. "Look at him," Sarah marveled, watching the cub investigate Margaret's medical bag with gentle paws. "He acts like your family." "Maybe I am," Margaret replied, kneeling to allow the cub to sniff her hands while Amara watched approvingly. "Maybe family doesn't always look like what we expect." As the sun set over the Serengeti, painting the grasslands in shades of gold and crimson, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her from the brink of suicide to this moment of profound connection with both her daughter and the wild creatures that had given her life new meaning. Her satellite phone buzzed with another message, this one from the Tanzanian Ministry of Wildlife Conservation. "Dr. Thompson, we're pleased to inform you that the Rebecca Mitchell Wildlife Medical Center has been selected as the pilot site for the International Wildlife Emergency Medicine Program. Your work will now be replicated in 12 African countries." Margaret looked at Sarah, then at Amara and her cub, then at the endless expanse of African wilderness that had become her unexpected home. At 67, she had discovered that the end of one story could be the beginning of something even more meaningful. "Ready to go change the world?" Sarah asked, settling back into the Land Cruiser for the drive home. "Again," Margaret replied with a smile. "Ready to go change the world again." Message for American seniors. At 67, Dr. Margaret Thompson thought her story was over. Widowed, estranged from her daughter, she traveled to Africa planning to end her life. Instead, she found her greatest purpose. Saving a lioness in emergency surgery led to creating Africa's most innovative wildlife medical program. 6 months later, she's training veterinarians, rebuilding her relationship with her daughter, and proving that your most meaningful chapter might begin when you think everything is ending. Margaret's courage to help when it mattered most didn't just save a lioness, it saved herself. Sometimes the life you're meant to live is waiting on the other side of your darkest moment. Your expertise, your compassion, your willingness to step outside your comfort zone, these don't expire with retirement. They might just be preparing you for your most important work yet. Questions for engagement. What skill or passion from your career could you use to make a difference in an unexpected way? Have you ever found purpose in helping others during your own difficult times? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might inspire someone else to discover their next chapter.